I like to think I have a lot to offer. Most of it may be bad or disappointing, but still a lot. Kind of like Herbert Baumeister, except his contributions to society were more illegal. Mine aren't, for the record. On paper, he was a successful businessman, devoted husband, and the kind of guy who probably had very strong opinions on proper handshake technique or lawn edging. Off paper, he had a habit of inviting men over. None of them ever walked back out. For years, men were disappearing around Indianapolis, and police weren't exactly racing to solve the mystery until Tony Harris showed up with a near-death experience and a license plate number that changed everything. What the investigators didn't realize, they were about to uncover something far worse than they ever expected, and that's really saying something considering this is Indiana. Before we dive in, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you're in the right place. Hit follow now for at least 2 new episodes per week. This is 10-Minute Murder. Let's get into it. There's a certain kind of house that just looks like it's hiding something. You know the type. Overgrown weeds, windows dark like empty eye sockets. The kind of place that makes you lock your car doors even though you're driving by and not even stopping. Fox Hollow Farm is one of those places. And if you've ever passed an abandoned property and thought, yeah, I bet some weird stuff went down there, congratulations. You might have investigative instincts, or at the very least, an understandable distrust of men with unfinished basements. Now let's hop in our little time machine and rewind to the 1990s, a time when grunge music was in. The internet wasn't, and police departments, specifically the ones in Indianapolis, were really good at not looking too hard into missing gay men. Not because the disappearances weren't piling up, but because, frankly, no one in power cared enough to connect the dots. But the dots were there. Young men, similar height, weight, and age, all last seen in the same part of town, and then nothing. No bodies, no leads, just an ever-growing list of faces on missing posters. For literal years, law enforcement quietly acknowledged the likelihood that a predator was hunting in Indianapolis. The pattern was too strong to ignore, even if the response was underwhelming. But without a suspect, the case remained nothing more than a whisper between detectives and a growing fear within the LGBTQ+ community. The police had a problem. They just didn't have a name. Not yet. For years, men had been disappearing from Indianapolis, and no one seemed to have answers, until one man decided he wasn't going to let his friend's disappearance become just another cold case. His name was Tony Harris, and in the summer of 1992, his friend, Roger Goodlett, vanished. Just gone. No explanation, no sign of struggle. Another face added to the growing stack of missing persons cases. But Tony wasn't buying it. He knew something was up. Something was really wrong. Determined to find out what happened, Tony started paying attention, especially to the bars where Roger had been last seen. That's when he noticed a man who stood out, not just because he was there frequently, but because he was interested in Roger's disappearance. Too interested. Asking questions, watching people's reactions. The man introduced himself as Brian Smart, a well-dressed, charismatic guy who seemed to know just the right amount to make Tony uneasy. And then, one night, Brian invited Tony back to the house for a few drinks. What happened next? It's the kind of thing that feels ripped out of a horror movie, except no one yelled cut. Brian led Tony to a massive home in the suburbs, where the vibe shifted from friendly to something else entirely. Drinks were poured, conversations turned strange, and at some point, Brian produced a pool hose, not for the pool, but for asphyxiation play. Tony went along at first, until he realized something terrifying. Brian wasn't stopping. Panic surged. Tony fought back, and somehow, miraculously, he got away. Tony sprinted to the police with his story. He told them about Roger's disappearance. He told them about Brian Smart. He told them about the pool hose and how he'd almost been killed. And for the first time, police had a lead. But there was just one problem. Brian Smart didn't exist. 3 years passed. No new leads, no arrests, no answers. It was as if Brian Smart had disappeared just as easily as the men he preyed on. Then one night, Tony saw him again. Same face, same smug confidence. But this time, Tony was ready. He followed him out of the bar, kept his distance, and when the man got into his car, Tony wrote down the license plate number. He went straight back to the police, and this time, they had something to work with. The plate was registered to a man named Herbert Baumeister. So, who was Herbert? On paper, he was everything you wouldn't expect from a serial killer. A well-off businessman, a husband, a father, a guy who owned a successful thrift store chain and lived in an upscale house with his wife and kids. But there was obviously another side to Herbert, one his family did not see. A history of bizarre, antisocial behavior stretching all the way back to his childhood, a deep fascination with death, a growing list of men who had gone missing after crossing his path, and a home where some of those men had gone, never to be seen again. There is no official record of childhood trauma in Herbert Baumeister's life, no major event that would explain why he grew into the kind of man who kept human remains on his property like they were landscaping choices. But what he did have was a collection of behaviors that should have sent up every red flag imaginable. For starters, he had an obsession with urine, and not like, haha, kids do weird stuff kind of way. He was fascinated by it, talked about it, and at one point, he even wondered out loud what it would be like to drink it. If that's not unsettling enough, he also developed a habit of urinating on his teachers' desks, which is less of a prank and more of a we should call someone situation. Then there was his fixation on death and decay. Other kids played with action figures. Herbert preferred dead animals. At some points, his father, who happened to be a well-respected anesthesiologist, realized that his son's behavior wasn't just quirky. Herbert was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. And then, nothing. No real treatment, no long-term psychiatric care, just a kid with unchecked mental illness and a growing list of reasons to be avoided. In 1971, Herbert Pisspants Baumeister married Juliana. And for anyone looking in from the outside, it seemed like he had pulled off the classic American dream. A wife, 3 kids, a successful business, and a big house in the suburbs. But beneath that white picket fence image, things were far from normal. Just 6 months into their marriage, Herbert was committed to a mental hospital. Not for a quick checkup, not for a weekend stay. He was there for an extended period, which in any healthy relationship would be a pretty serious red flag. Then there was the matter of their sex life, specifically the almost total lack of one. Juliana later revealed that in 25 years of marriage, they had sex less than 10 times. That's not a dry spell, that's a quarter century of avoidance. Herbert's behavior wasn't just distant, it was strange. He would go through bursts of energy and obsession with work, followed by long periods of being completely withdrawn. He had a way of making people uncomfortable, even when he was trying not to. Juliana always chalked it up to stress, eccentricity, and maybe even past trauma she didn't know anything about. But the reality was something much darker. While she was busy raising their kids and keeping up appearances, her husband was leading a very different life, one that would eventually unravel in the most horrifying way possible. For years, Herb managed to keep his secrets buried, literally. But by the mid-1990s, the cracks in his carefully constructed double life were beginning to show. Police wanted to search Fox Hollow Farm, the sprawling 18-acre property where Herbert and his wife and kids lived. They had enough suspicions to know something was off, but suspicions don't get you a search warrant. Herbert didn't hesitate. Absolutely not, he told them, and incredibly, Juliana backed him up. No warrant, no search, no evidence. For a while, that was the end of it, but Herbert wasn't exactly a man who handled pressure very well. He became more erratic, more unpredictable. Juliana had spent years excusing his behavior, but now she had enough. She wanted out. She wanted a divorce. And most importantly, she wanted him out of her life. And just like that, she did what she should have done years earlier. She let the police in. The moment the investigators stepped onto the property, they knew they were no longer just chasing a hunch. 11 sets of human remains were uncovered across the property. Bones scattered and burned. Some were so decomposed they couldn't even be identified. Then came a disturbing revelation. One of those bodies, it had already been discovered years earlier by Herbert's own son. Sometime in 1994, his teenage son had stumbled upon a human skull in the backyard. Most parents would panic, maybe call the police. Herbert, he just shrugged it off, told his kid it was a medical skeleton his father, an anesthesiologist, had given him. Then he reburied it. And somehow that explanation worked. But now there was no more hiding. The bones told the truth Herbert never would. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but Herbert, knowing he was caught, wasn't about to stick around and face justice. Instead, he fled to Canada, checked into a park near Lake Huron, and put a bullet in his own head. He left behind a 3-page suicide note, a final message to the world. And in all those pages, not a single mention of the 11 bodies found on his land. Not a word about his victims, their families, or the lives he stole. Instead, he rambled about his failing business and his collapsing marriage, as if those were the real tragedies of his life. Now that police knew Herbert was capable of murder, another question surfaced. Was this really his first time? The timeline was suspicious. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, bodies had been turning up along Interstate 70. Young men and teenage boys strangled to death and dumped in dishes. Then in 1991, the killing stopped. That also happened to be the exact year Herbert bought Fox Hollow Farm. Instead of leaving bodies in public, where they might be found, he now had his own private 18-acre burial ground. At least 11 victims from the I-70 murders matched his own M.O. If Herbert was also the I-70 Strangler, his true victim count could be much, much higher than anyone realizes. Now you would think after discovering 11 victims, Fox Hollow Farm would have been fully excavated, every inch of it searched. Nope. In 2022, investigators returned to the property and found even more human remains. At least 20 other locations on the property could still hold bodies, which raises the real question: how many victims did Herbert Baumeister leave behind? He died without ever admitting to a single murder. His victims' families never got closure. And somewhere beneath the soil at Fox Hollow Farm, there may still be more untold stories. Thanks for listening to 10-Minute Murder. If you liked this episode, hit subscribe and leave a review. It helps more true crime fans find the show. And if you're into stories with a little less murder and a little more mystery, check out my other podcast, 10-Minute Mystery. Same brief and bingeable format as this one, just fewer body bags. You can find everything at 10minutemurder.com. I'm Joe, the host, and I'll see you next time.